number. The CEO's paralyzed daughter was left alone at the airport until a single dad Saturday beside her. The fluorescent lights of Los Angeles International Airport hummed overhead like mechanical bees, casting their cold glow across the sea of stranded passengers. It was nearly midnight, and the terminal had transformed into a temporary shelter for hundreds of travelers whose flights had been delayed indefinitely due to a massive technical failure. Exhausted bodies sprawled across uncomfortable chairs, some curled up on the floor with jackets as makeshift pillows, while others paced anxiously near the departure gates. Among this chaos sat Claire Lane, 21 years old, alone in her wheelchair near Gate 47. Her designer clothes and expensive handbag marked her as someone of privilege, but her hollow eyes told a different story entirely. The battery indicator on her wheelchair blinked red, warning of imminent power failure, yet she made no move to seek help. She had learned long ago that asking for assistance only invited pity, and pity was something she couldn't bear to see in another person's eyes. Her phone buzzed with another message from her father's assistant, explaining that her personal aide had been called away on an urgent matter and wouldn't return until morning. Claire stared at the message, feeling the familiar sting of abandonment. Even her father, Richard Lane, CEO of one of the country's largest tech corporations, was too busy with a merger in Tokyo to personally ensure her safe journey home from her rehabilitation appointment. The announcement echoed through the terminal once again, informing passengers that all flights would remain grounded until further notice. Claire closed her eyes, trying to shut out the world around her, when she heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. She opened her eyes to see a man in his mid-30s setting down a worn duffel bag beside her chair. He had kind eyes and gentle hands that moved with practiced efficiency as he helped a small girl, no more than 6 years old, settle into the seat next to Claire's wheelchair. "Mind if we sit here?" the man asked, his voice warm despite the exhaustion that lined his face. "Everywhere else seems pretty crowded, and my daughter Ella here gets nervous in big crowds." Claire looked up, expecting to see the familiar expression of pity or discomfort that most people wore when they first noticed her wheelchair. Instead, she found only genuine kindness and a question that seemed to see her as simply another person seeking refuge in this chaotic night. Claire Lane had not always been confined to a wheelchair. Just 3 years earlier, she had been a rising star in the world of contemporary dance, her body moving with the grace and precision that had earned her a scholarship to one of the nation's most prestigious performing arts colleges. Her future had seemed bright and limitless, filled with stages and spotlights and the thunderous applause of captivated audiences. But on a rainy Thursday evening in November, a drunk driver had run a red light and changed everything in an instant. The accident had left her with complete paralysis from the waist down, but the physical injury was only part of the devastation. Her mother, unable to cope with the reality of her daughter's condition, had left the family 6 months after the accident. Her father, Richard Lane, had responded by building walls of protection around Claire that felt more like a prison than care. He hired the best doctors, bought the most advanced equipment, and surrounded her with assistants and caregivers, but he had never learned how to simply sit with her pain or celebrate her strength. Daniel Brooks carried his own burden of loss, though it was carved by different circumstances. At 34, he was a single father who had learned to navigate the world with a broken heart that had somehow learned to love even more fiercely. His wife Sarah had died in a plane crash 2 years earlier, leaving him to raise their daughter Ella alone. The irony was not lost on him that he now found himself stranded in an airport, the very place that had become synonymous with his greatest fear and deepest grief. Before Sarah's death, Daniel had worked as a rescue coordinator for the National Emergency Response Team, but after losing her, he had transitioned to a quieter job as a civil engineer. He spent his days designing bridges and his evenings helping Ella with homework, teaching her to ride a bike, and learning to braid her hair through countless YouTube tutorials. The grief had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something else, a profound understanding of how quickly life could change and how precious every moment of connection truly was. Ella Brooks was 6 years old and possessed the kind of fearless curiosity that could either drive adults to distraction or restore their faith in the magic of the world. She had her mother's bright blue eyes and her father's stubborn determination, combined with a natural empathy that seemed to recognize pain in others and respond with instinctive kindness. She had been too young to fully understand death when her mother died, but she understood that her father sometimes looked sad and that hugs could make almost anything better. The airport had become a strange sort of community as the hours stretched on. Passengers shared phone chargers and snacks, strangers struck up conversations, and children ran between the seats while their parents dozed fitfully. But Claire remained isolated in her corner, watching the activity around her like a visitor from another world. She had grown accustomed to being seen but not truly noticed, acknowledged but not included. "I'm Daniel," the man said, settling into the chair beside her wheelchair. "And this little chatterbox is Ella. We're supposed to be flying back to Denver, but it looks like we're going to be here for a while." He spoke easily, without the careful tone that most people used around her, as if her wheelchair was just another piece of furniture rather than a symbol of tragedy and limitation. Ella looked up from the coloring book she had pulled from her small backpack and studied Claire with the direct gaze that only children could manage without seeming rude. "Why do you look so sad?" she asked, her voice carrying the simple honesty that adults spent years learning to suppress. "Did someone take your favorite toy?" Claire felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth, despite herself. It had been months since anyone had asked her such a direct question about her emotions, and certainly no one had compared her sadness to something as simple and fixable as a missing toy. "Something like that," she replied, her voice rusty from disuse and casual conversation. Daniel noticed the red light blinking on Claire's wheelchair and frowned with concern. "Your battery's running low," he observed. "Have you been able to find a charging station? I think I saw one near the food court." Claire shook her head, embarrassed by her helplessness, but also wary of accepting help from a stranger. She had learned that kindness often came with hidden costs, and she wasn't sure she was strong enough to handle another disappointment. "I'll manage," she said quietly, though they both knew that wasn't really true. The wheelchair would stop working entirely within the next hour, leaving her completely stranded until help arrived. Ella seemed to sense the tension and reached into her backpack, pulling out a small package of gummy bears. She held them out to Claire with the solemnity of someone offering a precious gift. "These always make me feel better when I'm scared," Ella said. "Daddy says sugar helps your brain work better, but I think it just makes everything taste like happiness." Claire accepted the candy with surprise, touched by the child's spontaneous generosity. As she bit into the sweet gummy bear, she felt something inside her chest loosen slightly, a tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying. The conversation that followed was unlike any Claire had experienced in the 3 years since her accident. Daniel didn't ask probing questions about her condition or offer unsolicited advice about treatments and therapies. Instead, he talked about ordinary things: Ella's obsession with dinosaurs, his struggle to learn how to cook meals that didn't come from a box, the book he was reading about sustainable architecture. When Claire mentioned that she had once studied dance, he didn't respond with pity or awkward encouragement. He simply asked what type of dance she had preferred and listened with genuine interest as she described the feeling of movement and music combining into something transcendent. "I used to think dancing was about defying gravity," Claire said, surprised by her own openness. "But I think it was really about finding the perfect balance between control and surrender." Daniel nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the deeper meaning in her words. "That sounds like parenting," he replied. "You spend all day trying to keep them safe and teach them right from wrong, but eventually you have to trust that they'll know how to fly on their own." Ella had fallen asleep against her father's shoulder, her coloring book slipping from her small hands. Daniel adjusted his position carefully to support her weight, and Claire was struck by the tenderness of the gesture. It was such a simple thing, yet it spoke of countless nights and infinite patience and love that asked for nothing in return. She couldn't remember the last time someone had held her with such unconscious care. "She's lucky to have you," Claire said softly, and Daniel's expression grew serious. "I'm the lucky one," he replied. "She saved my life in ways she'll never understand. After Sarah died, I thought about giving up more times than I care to admit. But Ella needed me, and somehow that need became a reason to keep going, and then eventually it became a reason to start living again." The lights in the terminal dimmed slightly as the airport settled into its late-night rhythm. Security guards made their rounds, maintenance crews worked quietly in the distance, and the occasional announcement echoed through the space. Claire found herself relaxing for the first time in months, lulled by the ordinary comfort of human conversation and the strange intimacy that develops between strangers thrown together by circumstance. "Can I ask what happened?" Daniel said gently, and Claire stiffened instinctively. But something in his tone told her that this wasn't idle curiosity or morbid fascination. He was asking because he cared, because he saw her as a whole person whose story mattered. So she told him about the accident, about the months of surgery and rehabilitation, about her mother's departure and her father's suffocating protection. She told him about the way people looked at her now, with either pity or inspiration, both of which felt like different forms of invisibility. "I feel like I died in that car," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like the person I was before just disappeared, and this broken version is all that's left. Sometimes I think it would have been easier if I hadn't survived at all." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and Claire immediately regretted her honesty. She had never spoken those words aloud before, and they hung in the air between them like a confession that couldn't be taken back. "I know that feeling," Daniel said finally. "After Sarah died, I used to lie awake at night wishing I had been on that plane with her. It seemed impossibly cruel that she was gone and I was still here, trying to figure out how to live in a world that no longer made sense. But gradually I realized that survival isn't about being unbroken. It's about finding ways to be whole even with the missing pieces." The power flickered suddenly, plunging sections of the terminal into temporary darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting long shadows across the rows of seats, and several passengers stirred nervously. Claire's wheelchair emitted a soft beeping sound as its battery finally reached critical levels, and she felt a familiar surge of panic at her own helplessness. But before she could retreat into herself, she felt Ella's small hand slip into hers. "It's okay," the little girl whispered, having awakened during the power fluctuation. "Daddy says darkness is just light that's sleeping. It always comes back." Her words were so simple and matter-of-fact that Claire felt tears spring to her eyes. When was the last time someone had comforted her instead of the other way around? When had she stopped being the person who offered reassurance and become only the person who needed it? Daniel stood up and surveyed the situation with the calm efficiency of someone trained to handle emergencies. "I'm going to find a maintenance person and see about getting you plugged in somewhere," he said to Claire. "Will you be okay here with Ella for a few minutes?" The question was practical, but it also carried an implicit trust that touched Claire deeply. He wasn't treating her like an invalid who needed constant supervision. He was asking her to watch his most precious possession while he solved a problem. While Daniel was gone, Claire and Ella sat together in the dim emergency lighting, and the little girl began to chatter about her plans for when they finally reached Denver. She was going to visit her grandmother, who made the best chocolate chip cookies in the world and always let her stay up past her bedtime. She wanted to show her grandmother the drawing she had made of a purple dinosaur wearing a tutu, because her grandmother appreciated art even when it didn't look exactly like real life. "Do you have a grandmother?" Ella asked, and Claire nodded, remembering her father's mother who had passed away the year before the accident. "She used to tell me stories about brave princesses who saved themselves," Claire said. "She always said that the best fairy tales were the ones where the princess discovered she had been strong all along." Ella considered this solemnly and then announced, "I think you're like one of those princesses. You just haven't figured out your superpower yet." The innocence of the statement hit Claire like a physical blow, but not with pain this time. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the false cheerfulness that people tried to impose on her situation, but genuine hope that perhaps there was still something valuable and powerful within her that the accident hadn't destroyed. Daniel returned with a maintenance worker who helped them relocate to a nearby seating area with accessible power outlets. As Claire's wheelchair began to charge, she felt a sense of relief that went beyond the practical. For the first time in 3 years, accepting help hadn't felt like admitting defeat. It had felt like being part of a community, like being cared for by people who saw her as worthy of effort and attention. The night deepened around them, but the 3 unlikely companions continued to talk. Daniel shared stories of his work designing infrastructure that could withstand natural disasters, his voice carrying the passion of someone who had found purpose in creating things that would protect others. Claire found herself describing her rehabilitation center, not with the usual bitterness, but with recognition of the strength it had taken to endure months of painful therapy and small victories. "I used to think healing meant going back to who I was before," she said. "But maybe it means becoming someone new. Someone who incorporates the broken pieces instead of trying to hide them." Ella nodded wisely, as if this made perfect sense to her 6-year-old understanding of the world. "Like when I broke my favorite cup," she said. "Daddy glued it back together, and now it has pretty gold lines where the cracks used to be. It's even more beautiful than before." Around 3 in the morning, an elderly passenger near the information desk suddenly collapsed, clutching his chest and gasping for breath. Panic rippled through the nearby crowd as people shouted for help and fumbled for their phones. Daniel immediately sprang into action, his rescue training taking over as he knelt beside the man and began checking his vital signs. But it was Claire who surprised everyone, including herself. Despite being in her wheelchair, she positioned herself near the man's head and began directing the crowd with calm authority. "Someone call 911 and ask for paramedics," she called out. "You there, in the blue shirt, go find airport security and tell them we have a medical emergency at gate 47. Everyone else, please step back and give us room to work." Her voice carried the kind of natural leadership that made people instinctively listen and respond. Daniel worked to stabilize the man while Claire coordinated the response, her mind sharp and focused in a way it hadn't been since before the accident. She found herself drawing on knowledge from her rehabilitation experience, understanding of medical procedures, and an inner strength she had forgotten she possessed. When the paramedics arrived, they praised both Daniel and Claire for their quick thinking and effective teamwork. As the ambulance pulled away with the stabilized patient, a small crowd of passengers approached Claire with gratitude and admiration. "You saved his life," an older woman said, her eyes bright with tears. "If you hadn't taken charge like that, we would have just stood there panicking. You were incredible." Claire felt a flush of something she couldn't quite identify at first, and then she realized it was pride. Not the hollow pride of achievements that belonged to someone else, but genuine satisfaction in her own competence and worth. Daniel returned to their seating area with Ella, who had watched the entire emergency response with wide eyes. "That was amazing," he said, settling back into his chair. "You didn't just help save that man's life, Claire. You led the entire response. You took charge of a chaotic situation and made everyone around you better and calmer and more effective." The admiration in his voice was unmistakable, and for once, Claire didn't deflect or minimize her contribution. "I used to be good in a crisis," she said thoughtfully. "I had forgotten that about myself. I think I've been so focused on what I lost that I stopped paying attention to what I still have." Ella climbed into her father's lap and looked seriously at Claire. "See," she said with satisfaction, "I told you that you were like a princess with a superpower. You just needed the right kind of emergency to figure it out." The revelation of her own capability had shifted something fundamental in Claire's understanding of herself, but the night was far from over. Around 4 a.m, just as she was beginning to feel genuinely hopeful for the first time in years, she heard a voice that made her blood run cold. "Claire Elizabeth Lane, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" Richard Lane stood at the edge of their seating area like an avenging angel in a $1,000 suit, his face thunderous with rage and embarrassment. Behind him stood 2 security guards and his personal assistant, all looking deeply uncomfortable with the scene they were about to witness. Claire's father was a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment, and finding his disabled daughter sitting with strangers in an airport at 4 a.m. was clearly not part of his carefully managed world. "Dad," Claire said, her voice small and uncertain. All the confidence she had felt just minutes earlier began to evaporate under her father's furious stare. "My flight was delayed, and Marcus had to leave for that emergency, and I was just..." Richard cut her off with a sharp gesture, his attention turning to Daniel with the kind of cold assessment that had made him legendary in corporate boardrooms. "And you are?" he asked, his tone making it clear that whatever Daniel's answer might be, it would not be sufficient. Daniel stood up slowly, his protective instincts clearly activated by the older man's aggressive posture. "Daniel Brooks," he replied evenly. "Your daughter was alone and needed help with her wheelchair battery. We were just keeping each other company during the delay." Richard's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Of course you were," he said. "Do you have any idea who my daughter is? Who I am? Because if you think you can take advantage of a vulnerable young woman to get to me or my money, you've made a serious miscalculation." The accusation hung in the air like a slap, and Claire felt her cheeks burn with humiliation and rage. "Dad, stop," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Daniel didn't take advantage of anyone. He helped me when I was stranded and scared and completely alone because the person you hired to take care of me abandoned me for your precious business emergency. He and Ella sat with me and talked with me and treated me like a human being instead of a problem to be managed." But Richard was beyond listening to reason. His entire world was built on the premise that he could protect his daughter from further harm by controlling every variable in her environment, and the sight of her sitting independently with strangers represented a fundamental threat to that system. "Security," he said to the guards behind him. "I want this man removed from the terminal immediately. I don't care what you have to do or what story you have to create. Get him away from my daughter." Daniel looked at Claire with an expression of profound sadness, recognizing that any resistance on his part would only make the situation worse for her. "It's okay," he said quietly, gathering Ella into his arms. "We need to go anyway. Our flight will probably be boarding soon." But his eyes told a different story, and Claire could see that he understood exactly what was happening and how powerless they both were to stop it. "No," Claire said, her voice breaking. "Dad, please don't do this. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like myself again. I felt strong and capable and valued, and you're taking that away from me, just like you take everything else away." Tears streamed down her face as she looked back and forth between her father's implacable expression and Daniel's resigned acceptance. "This is for your own good," Richard said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "You don't understand the world the way I do. You don't know how people will try to use you, how they'll pretend to care about you when they really want to get to me. I won't let anyone hurt you like that." The words came out like a prepared speech, something he had told himself so many times that he almost believed it was true. Daniel knelt down and whispered something to Ella, who nodded solemnly and walked over to Claire's wheelchair. "This is for you," she said, pressing the drawing of the purple tutu-wearing dinosaur into Claire's hands. "So you won't forget that you're brave and strong and special. Daddy says that sometimes people have to say goodbye, but that doesn't mean they stop caring about each other." The security guards stepped forward, and Daniel submitted to their escort without protest, understanding that any scene would only make things harder for Claire. As they walked away, Ella turned back one last time and waved, her small face serious but unafraid. Claire clutched the drawing to her chest and sobbed, feeling more alone and abandoned than she had ever felt in her life. Richard dismissed the security guards and sat down heavily in the chair that Daniel had vacated. For the first time, Claire noticed that her father looked older than his 55 years, that there were lines of worry and exhaustion around his eyes that hadn't been there before her accident. But her compassion was overwhelmed by her anger and grief at having something precious torn away from her just as she was beginning to heal. "I hate you," she whispered, her voice raw with pain. "I hate that you've made my whole life about your fear. I hate that you can't see me as anything but broken and helpless. And I hate that you just destroyed the first real connection I've had with anyone since the accident because you're too scared to let me live my own life." Richard recoiled as if she had physically struck him, but before he could respond, the terminal's fire alarm began blaring with deafening intensity. Emergency lights flashed red and white, and panicked announcements echoed through the space, instructing everyone to evacuate immediately through the nearest exits. Smoke was beginning to filter through the air conditioning system, and the acrid smell of burning electronics filled the air. In the chaos that followed, normal social boundaries disappeared entirely. Passengers who had been strangers minutes earlier were helping each other gather belongings and navigate toward the exits. Parents carried sleepy children, elderly travelers supported each other, and airline staff worked frantically to coordinate the evacuation. But in the midst of all this organized chaos, one small voice rose above the noise in pure terror. "Daddy! Daddy, where are you?" Ella's scream cut through the alarm bells and shouting like a knife, and Claire's heart clenched with immediate recognition and fear. Somehow, in the confusion and crowd, the little girl had become separated from Daniel and was now lost in a sea of panicking adults. Claire could see her across the terminal, pressed against a wall and crying hysterically as people rushed past her toward the exits. Without thinking, Claire released the brake on her wheelchair and began pushing herself through the crowd toward Ella's location. The battery was still low, and she had to rely mostly on her own strength to propel the chair forward. But desperation gave her power she didn't know she possessed. People bumped into her and pushed past her, some pausing to ask if she needed help, but she couldn't spare attention for anything except reaching the terrified child. Richard called after her, his voice barely audible above the alarms, but Claire ignored him completely. For the first time in 3 years, she had a clear purpose that had nothing to do with her own limitations or her father's fears. Ella needed her, and that need was more important than any physical obstacle or social convention. She was no longer a victim or a patient or a problem to be solved. She was simply someone who could help. The smoke was getting thicker, and the crowd was becoming more frantic in their rush toward the exits. Claire realized that Ella was in real danger of being trampled by people who couldn't see her small form in the chaos. Summoning strength she didn't know she still had, Claire positioned her wheelchair between Ella and the surging crowd, creating a protective barrier around the frightened child. "Ella, it's me, Claire," she called out, trying to keep her voice calm despite her own fear. "I'm going to get you to your daddy, but I need you to hold on to my chair and stay close to me, okay?" Ella's tear-streaked face looked up with desperate hope, and she immediately grabbed onto the side of Claire's wheelchair with both small hands. Together, they began moving toward the evacuation routes, but progress was slow and dangerous. Claire's chair was heavy and unwieldy in the crowd, and several times they were nearly separated by the press of bodies around them. But each time, Ella held on tighter, and Claire found reserves of determination she had forgotten she possessed. She was protecting someone else, and that purpose gave her a strength that had nothing to do with the function of her legs. Halfway to the exit, Claire spotted Daniel fighting his way back through the crowd, his face desperate with panic as he searched for his daughter. "Daniel!" She shouted as loudly as she could, waving one arm while keeping the other on her wheel to maintain control. "Over here! I have Ella!" The relief on his face when he saw them was overwhelming, and he immediately began pushing through the crowd toward their location. But the evacuation was becoming more chaotic by the minute, and a surge of panicked passengers nearly knocked Claire's wheelchair over. Ella screamed and lost her grip, and for a terrifying moment Claire thought they would be separated. But then she felt strong hands steadying her chair, and she looked up to see Richard beside her, his face grim with determination. "Hold on to both of us," he told Ella, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed even in the midst of crisis. Together, father and daughter created a protective formation around the little girl, moving as a unit toward the exit where Daniel was desperately trying to reach them. For the first time in years, Claire and her father were working together toward a common goal, and she felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. The evacuation took nearly an hour, but eventually all passengers and staff were safely relocated to a temporary shelter area in another part of the airport complex. The fire had been contained to a single maintenance area, and while there had been significant smoke damage, no one had been seriously injured. As the all-clear was given and people began to settle into their temporary accommodations, Daniel finally reached Claire and Ella. The reunion was everything Claire had hoped to see. Daniel swept Ella into his arms and held her so tightly that she squeaked in protest, covering her face with kisses and whispering words of love and relief. But when he turned to Claire, his expression was filled with a gratitude so profound that it took her breath away. "You saved her," he said simply. "When I couldn't find her, when I thought I might lose the only family I have left, you were there. You put yourself between her and danger, and you brought her back to me. I don't have words for what that means to me." His voice broke on the last words, and Claire felt tears streaming down her own face. "She saved me first," Claire replied. "She and you both did. You reminded me that I'm still here, that I'm still capable of mattering to someone. When I saw her in danger, I didn't think about my wheelchair or my limitations. I just knew I had to help, and somehow that was enough." Richard had been standing quietly nearby, watching the interaction with an expression Claire couldn't quite read. Now he stepped forward, his usual commanding presence somehow diminished. "Mr. Compizance, Brooks," he said formally, "I owe you an apology. I misjudged your intentions and your character, and I treated you badly because of my own fears. You and your daughter gave my Claire something I haven't been able to give her in 3 years, the chance to see herself as strong and valuable and whole." Daniel studied the older man carefully, seeing the pain and regret behind his corporate facade. "You don't need to apologize to me," he said quietly. "You need to apologize to her. And more than that, you need to listen to her and trust her and let her make her own choices about how to live her life." The words were gentle but firm, carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom about loss and healing and love. The remainder of the night passed in a strange kind of peace. The three of them sat together in the emergency shelter, sharing stories and finding connections that transcended their different backgrounds and circumstances. Richard asked questions about Claire's experience that he had never thought to ask before, listening to her answers with the attention he usually reserved for board meetings and merger negotiations. When Claire described the moment she had decided to go after Ella, her father's eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. "I've spent 3 years trying to protect you from the world," he said. "But tonight you protected someone else, and you were magnificent. I've been so afraid of losing you that I forgot you were already gone, not because of the accident, but because I locked you away from everything that makes life worth living." As dawn began to break over Los Angeles, the airport gradually returned to normal operations. Flights were rescheduled, passengers were transferred to working terminals, and the crisis became just another story to tell about travel delays and unexpected adventures. But for Claire, everything had changed in ways that could never be undone. Airport officials approached their small group with news that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. The elderly passenger Daniel and Claire had helped earlier in the night had made a full recovery, and his family wanted to express their gratitude. More than that, airport security had reviewed the surveillance footage of both the medical emergency and the evacuation, and they wanted to publicly recognize Claire's leadership and bravery. "We don't usually do this," the airport manager explained, "but what you did tonight was extraordinary. You took charge of a medical emergency and probably saved a man's life, and then you risked your own safety to rescue a child during the evacuation. We'd like to honor you at our next community safety recognition ceremony, if you're willing." Claire looked around at the faces surrounding her. Her father, proud and amazed. Daniel, admiring and grateful. Ella, beaming with the satisfaction of someone whose faith in others has been vindicated. For the first time in 3 years, she saw herself reflected in their eyes, not as someone to be pitied or protected, but as someone who had acted with courage and strength when it mattered most. "I'd be honored," she said, and meant it completely. The wheelchair that had once seemed like a symbol of everything she had lost now felt like simply one part of who she was, no more defining than her hair color or her height. She was Claire Lane, daughter and friend and protector of children and leader in crises. The accident had taken her legs, but it had not taken her power or her worth or her ability to make a difference in the world. As they prepared to board their respective flights, the goodbyes were bittersweet but not desperate. Daniel and Ella would return to Denver, and Claire would go home with her father, but the connections they had forged would not be broken by geography. They had found each other in the darkest part of the night and discovered that even strangers could become family when they chose to see each other's true worth. "This isn't goodbye," Daniel said, as he hugged Claire carefully. "This is just the end of the beginning. You know who you are now, and you know what you're capable of. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you to forget that." Ella presented Claire with one final gift, a new drawing, this one showing 3 figures standing together under a bright sun, with the words "Super Friends Forever" written in purple crayon across the top. Richard pushed Claire's wheelchair toward their boarding gate, but the dynamic between them had shifted fundamentally. He was no longer the controlling protector, and she was no longer the helpless patient. They were father and daughter, both wounded by life, but both capable of healing if they chose to face their fears together. "What happens now?" Claire asked, as they settled into their seats on the plane. Richard was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the sunrise, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. "Now we figure out how to live," he said finally. "Really live, not just survive. I think that means letting you make your own choices, even when those choices scare me, especially when they scare me." The flight home was smooth and uneventful, but Claire spent most of it staring out the window and thinking about the night that had changed everything. She thought about Ella's simple declaration that she was like a princess who just hadn't discovered her superpower yet, and about Daniel's quiet insistence that survival was about being whole even with missing pieces. Most of all, she thought about the moment when she had stopped seeing herself as broken and started seeing herself as someone who could act, who could lead, who could save others instead of merely being saved. 6 months later, Claire Lane stood, or rather, sat before a packed auditorium at the Los Angeles International Airport, accepting the Community Hero Award for her actions during the November emergency. In the audience sat Daniel and Ella Brooks, who had flown in from Denver to witness the ceremony. Richard Lane sat in the front row, beaming with a pride that had nothing to do with corporate achievements or financial success, and everything to do with the remarkable woman his daughter had always been, even when neither of them could see it. In her acceptance speech, Claire spoke about the night that had taught her the difference between being a victim and being a survivor, between being protected and being empowered, between existing and truly living. "I learned that strength isn't about what your body can do," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "It's about what your heart chooses to do when someone else needs you to be strong. And I learned that the most powerful thing any of us can do is to see the worth in each other, especially when that worth is hidden by circumstances or fear or pain." The applause was thunderous, but Claire barely heard it. She was looking at the faces of the people who had helped her find herself again, her father, who had learned to trust her, Daniel, who had seen her strength before she remembered it herself, and Ella, who had never doubted that there was magic hidden inside the sad lady in the wheelchair. They had all been strangers once, brought together by delays and emergencies and the kind of cosmic coincidence that changes lives forever. As the ceremony concluded and people began to file out of the auditorium, Claire remained on the stage for a moment, savoring the feeling of being exactly where she belonged. The wheelchair was still there, and it always would be. The paralysis was still real, and the challenges were still significant. But none of that